My name is Michael Coates. I'm a former firefighter, but I'm also a former soldier. And it's the stories from the individuals within this military community that I'm desperate to document. Our next guest is a world-leading psychiatrist who specialises in psychological trauma. He spent 16 years in the Royal Air Force. He was part of the team who rehabilitated the Beirut hostages. He has worked with adult survivors of sexual abuse and now treats military veterans who have some serious complex cases of PTSD. Episode 4, Walter Busuttil. This is Declassified. It's a real privilege having you here, Walter. I know your time's super precious and you are an extremely important individual. But how's your day been so far?
Not too bad. I've just come from a meeting with the MOD, the strategy meeting for charities, which was brilliant. I was sitting in for our chief exec, who's away on leave, and it's a privilege to work with lots and lots of people, the MOD, charities, NHS, and we all try and help veterans and their families, not only just for mental health, but for everything really, as much as possible, and even serving personnel and their families.
I mean, the work you do is so important, and when we've ever engaged before and we've sat on a few panels and done a few bits and pieces together, I use inspiration a lot in these podcasts, and the work you guys do is really inspirational. But before all of that, I want to take you right the way back to a young Walter who grew up in Malta. And what was life like growing up in?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I was born in 1959, so that's quite a long time ago, 58 years ago, and many of my family had, if you like, been either children or young adults, or else even old enough to actually have fought in the Second World War. And there was a lot of devastation in Malta. They had the Coventry raid equivalent every day for 2 years in terms of bombing. So I certainly heard a lot of stories of bravery and people who were faced with big adversity. And quite a number of my uncles had been in the military as well. And my grandfather had fought in the First World War. He just got to the front when the war ended, actually, and then in the Second World War, he was very involved in the war in Malta.
Was there a lot of devastation when you was a young boy then, growing up? Did you see it? Did you experience it, or was it all rebuilt by then?
It was all rebuilt by then, but we still had ration books when I was a boy. So I think that came kind of. I think in Britain the ration books had gone before I was born, but in Malta we still had them. So I still remember them in the 60s. And we still had the odd person who was walking around, clearly an amputee and clearly had been ex-military. And a lot of ex-servicemen had settled in Malta as well after the war. So it was kind of, part of our kind of history. There'd been a great siege, the Knights of St. John, 1565, and now the second great siege in the Second World War. And the First World War, Malta was the kind of nursemaid of the Mediterranean. It had a lot of hospitals there built, especially taking casualties from Gallipoli. So the tradition in Malta was all about service, military service, and people who'd actually kind of been involved in, if you like, getting people better as well.
You mentioned your granddad there. Would your granddad a kind of role model to you growing up? Did you speak to him a lot about what he'd been through?
I was very young. I mean, I was maybe 5, 6, maybe 8, 9, 10 as well. I was sent to spend time with my granddad because I was quite a naughty boy. And he told me quite a bit about what happened during the war and, his role and role of his friends. And, and then I had stories from my mum, for example, next door was bombed out and, things about that. And so I was quite influenced and I was quite interested, I think, even from a very young age, to see how people coped with, huge adversity. And most of them were not ill. Most of them had kind of minor issues, a bit of anxiety, perhaps, I would say now. But most of them were very resilient. And it seemed to have made them better people for all their suffering.
I mean, we're jumping here.
Yeah.
And you weren't thinking like that as a little one, though. I mean, was you still like, was the kind of culture of Malta, was it? Because you really talked a lot about the military side of things there and the war, especially the Second World War and the siege, and that being such an important or such an influential part of the history of Malta and especially your family.
Yeah.
But for you, you couldn't have been thinking like that as a little one.
Well, no, but it was always intriguing. I think, I was always kind of fascinated by war films and what made kind of people tick and how people worked as a team.
Really, as a little one?
It was always kind of really interesting. Yeah. I found it kind of fascinating. I mean, I knew I knew in Malta, from Malta, I'd never joined the military, and I kind of first wanted to be a vet and then maybe a doctor, but I never thought I'd join the military. It came as a shock when I did.
So why? So we ended up in 1978 in Manchester.
Yeah.
But before that happened, how did you get to the UK?
Well, what happened was I'd passed my A-levels, and I had I was hopeful to get a place in a medical school in Malta, the only one that was there. And the government under Don Mintoff was quite a kind of difficult prime minister at the time, had a fight with the doctors, and the doctors were all sacked and the medical school effectively closed. So a friend of mine applied to go to England, and I said, there's no way I'm ever going. And he said, well, here's an application form, fill it in, and he cajoled me to fill it. And we applied together, and I got in and he didn't. He got in the year later. So I found myself with a place in medical school in Manchester, and I went to my dad. I said, look, I've got accepted, but of course you can't afford it, and I'll become a footballer or work in a bank, and that's fine. And he said, no, I will send you, and just do your best. So that's how I came to be here.
So 18 years old, you turned up in Manchester, and was it a culture shock to arrive in?
It was. I'd never been to Britain before. It was a bit of a shock. It rained a lot, which is kind of very different from Malta. And it was quite cold, I thought. But I made a lot of friends, and it was good. It was good.
Yeah. I mean, so it didn't take you long though then to join the RAF. So you went to you studied general medicine at Manchester.
Yeah.
And then it seems like, although we have the background there, it seems like was it an odd kind of turn of events to join the RAF?
Well, it was a bit, because my dad had a heart attack in my second year at medical school, and I thought, really, the family shouldn't be paying for me. So I thought, what can I do to be self-supporting? And I knew that, parts of my family had been in the Navy and the Army. So I thought, well, I'll be the first in the Air Force. So I applied, and much to my surprise, I got in, which was fantastic. So I was a medical student, excuse me, in the Air Force. And when I graduated, I had to serve for 5 years after my house job. So I finished my house jobs in Manchester, and then I spent 5 years in the Air Force, and I was told that for these 5 years I had to be a general duties medical officer, train as a GP if I wanted to, but I couldn't specialise. So I did, and for the first year I was at RAF Waddington, but then sent to Ethiopia just after the famine, during the famine in 1985, and before that to the Falklands for 4 months, which was really kind of formative in 1984, so well after the war, but it was still an interesting place. Yeah. And then I got sent to Germany, where I spent the rest 4.5 years in Germany, training as a GP at RAF Laarbruch with fast jet flying stations. So I had a great time. Was the
because I've got to kind of push and pull you a little bit, because there's so much to talk about.
Yeah.
And what I don't want to do is I don't want to miss some real vital things that some of the topics we want to cover. But you ended up in psychiatry in 1989 as a psychiatrist.
I did, yes. I'd qualified as a GP, and then I was about to leave the Air Force, and I told the head of general practice, I said, look, I'm going to leave because I want to be a psychiatrist. I like talking to people. I need to give them time to talk. So if you don't put me down for retraining in psychiatry, I'm leaving. And he let me go, and so I joined the psychiatric division, which was fantastic. So I got from Germany to RAF Hospital Rawton, and the first thing my boss talked to me about, that was Gordon Turnbull, was he said, look, here are the plans for the Beirut hostages. I said, well, what are these plans? Surely they're dead. And he said, no, we will probably get them out if they're alive, and this is what I want you to do. My first job was to look at what potential mental health issues they could suffer, and then we were going to plan how we're going to help them to get back to normal.
So you qualified as a psychiatrist, then the plans are put in front of you. I mean, because
I joined as a trainee psychiatrist, and the plans were put in front of me. Yeah, so I was very brand new.
What year is it? So this is 1989.
This is 1989. Yes, the hostages then were released in 1991.
So I mean, I remember as a kid, maybe about 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah, 7 or 8, and we're referring to kind of Terry Waite. I mean, he's the most famous of the three really that you helped. Yeah. And it really sparked kind of imagination in the UK. That's what I remember being really intrigued by this growing up and watching it on TV. And for those that don't know, he spent nearly 5 years held as a hostage in Beirut.
That's right.
4 years of that was solitary confinement. And if we jump to now 91, how you're part of the team that's then sent in really to help
Yeah.
these guys and assist them in their rehabilitation. Where do you start? Because that's
Well, it's
quite something.
It's quite difficult, what I learned when I read all the background papers and talked to other people was that you should look out for physical health problems and mental health problems, and then you need to look out for personality change. So the physical health would be linked to kind of heavy metals in the water, contamination, lack of vitamins, being beaten, maybe a brain injury. So, those were real physical issues that we had physicians to help with, and, all the hostages and were properly examined. From a mental health point of view, we were looking out for things like depression, anxiety, obsessionality, people having to do things in a certain way because of the confines of their captivity, but also post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we looked as well for people's personality changing for the worse, where they'd become perhaps more insular, selfish, or else for post-traumatic growth, where actually they'd learn from their experience, they would appreciate life more, they'd think about their family and their friends in a very different way, especially if they were held in solitary confinement for a very long time. And really, we kind of looked for all of those. So my role, first of all, was to see what the literature said, write a paper or two in relation to what we might find. And then Gordon's role and the rest of the team, they set up a plan in relation to not only retrieval, but also in relation to how we're going to deal with the hostage and then their families as well, because we needed the family to reintegrate that person properly. So it's not about just return, it's about reintegration. And of course, the problem with families is when, for example, we have prisoners of war or people missing in action in combat, as well as being kidnapped and taken hostage. The issue is that the family may kind of go into a grieving process, believing that that person may never return. And if the grieving process completes, then it's very difficult if that person does turn up alive to reintegrate that person into the family. So that's called anticipatory grief, and it was described by Lindemann in 1944. It's a Second World War concept, but it was really important to have done all that reading because it makes it so much easier not to have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
So really what that exercise with the hostages particularly taught me is that most things that one needs to do have actually been done before, but it's really important to be familiar with what actually has been done. And it's really important as well that if you discover something or you do something that's a bit out of the ordinary, that you document it, you write a paper, and you publish it if possible, so other people can learn.
Do you test things out then with people like the Beirut hostage? Are you testing things? Are you saying, this could be best practice? Let's try something.
Yes, you examine, you do an assessment of the situation, and then you try and employ best practice. Yeah.
So it's really important to actually listen to what someone's saying rather than preempt.
Absolutely, very important to listen. I think a lot of psychiatry and mental health and counselling and therapy is about listening and being listened to, and I think that's a very relevant point.
And how difficult was it then to, because you've been a doctor essentially for quite a long time now, but as your real affairs kind of and very public case with the Beirut hostages, how difficult was it to actually achieve?
It was easy because we were protected at RAF Lynham, if you remember. We had the world's press there, and, it is a bit shocking to see, I don't know, there must have been over 1,000 photographers when the hostages came out of the aeroplane. We were in the aeroplane. I was in the aeroplane with Terry Waite, for example. And but it was okay because the hostage was whisked away either for some did a quick media interview. Others just went straight to the officers' mess at Lynham, where we had a dedicated wing, where the family was there. The family met the hostage in private, which was really positive, without the cameras there, without us there. And then we kind of embarked in a model where we tried to reintegrate the family, and that lasted about 10 days.
Oh, really? So it's quite a short
space
of time. Was it intense?
Yeah, it was pretty intense. It was long-term to a degree. I mean, if people needed support later, we did meet them, but not necessarily all together or as a group. But it was intense, but it really worked, and I think it helped people to learn, both the family members and the hostage, how each other had coped, and if you like, it reassured everybody because people always feared the worst.
Did I'm kind of, it's a bit self-indulgent now. Was we aware that the hostages were still alive when this all was going on? I'm assuming so, because 2 years before there was a plan in place.
Well,
Was there regular contact?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
Okay.
I was kind of too junior to know this.
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
I really don't know. I was told this is your role as your kind of almost secondary duty. Yes, you're going to study and pass all your exams and see quite a few patients, but this is your kind of research role. This is what we want you to do. And, you know, I was fairly incredulous to start with because I didn't think, honestly, that we would have anybody out alive.
Yeah.
But of course, you know, other people perhaps knew better than me.
And from start to finish, you said that initial period was 10 days. And by the way, we're speaking about Terry Waite and whatnot because it's very well documented. He's wrote books and
that's right.
he's
He's described how he was.
Exactly. So we're not breaking anything here. There's just cause to talk about this. Did it carry on after the 10 days? Did the full? I'm assuming so because it was.
Yes,
such a long period.
I mean, each person on the team had a key person to work with. I personally wasn't working with Terry. Gordon Turnbull was working with Terry, as he described in his book, and that relationship just carried on over the years. So you know, people have remained in contact if they needed it. Most didn't, and that's good. But really what we gathered from all of the hostages was that they grew as individuals. They weren't particularly ill from a mental health point of view at all. They saw life in a very different way, and they appreciated their family, their beliefs, and the meaning of life in a very different way. And nowadays we'd call this post-traumatic growth, which is a really important and evolving sphere of trauma and traumatic stress psychology. That people need to appreciate that terrible things will happen in life, especially if we're put in harm's way. But equally, not only do we perhaps have a proportion, and it's not the majority, but a small proportion of people become mentally unwell, but they, as well as people who don't become mentally unwell, can actually grow in their personality. So you could actually have a paradoxical situation where you have a mental illness like PTSD, but actually the meaning of things around you actually has improved, and your outlook on life has improved, but you're not well, or else, if you're lucky, you're not mentally ill, but your perception about people around you, God, meaning of life has changed and usually improved for the better.
You might not know this, but you've had, as an individual, such a big impact on this podcast as well, and you were the first person I'd heard talk about post-traumatic growth. I don't know if you remember, I asked you a question about it.
That's right.
And we really delve into that now. The first two episodes with Brian and then Terry, you can see it. You can see their growth. And Terry only the other day fought for another world title and won. And you can see it in the fight. This guy is not. You can't take this person anywhere where he hasn't been before.
Yes.
In a physical and also a mental strength sense. And I'm going to push into post-traumatic growth a little bit later on as well, because I think it's such the narrative of it resonates with people. It absolutely resonates with people, and for me, it shouldn't end at the post-traumatic stress or the depression or the anxiety. Actually, what it should end at the growth and whatnot. So we dealt with the Beirut hostages, and it's quite a loose term putting that, and then we went on because the Gulf War followed.
That's right. Then, the Gulf War, it was good. It was interesting for me because I actually had a war role when I was trained General Duties Medical Officer, and I expected to be called back to that war role with fast jet squadrons, but I wasn't. I was still a junior psychiatrist, and I was told, you're not a qualified psychiatrist, so you cannot be deployed, and I was very upset about that. Okay. But I was then told, actually, we want you to work with one of our very senior consultants who was an ex-RAF, John Rollins, taught me a lot, and with Gordon Turnbull as well, to help set up a rehab service for people coming back from Gulf War One. And then Gordon was deployed, so really in the end it was myself and John Rollins, and we set up a brief intervention for people coming back, which had three main kind of areas to deal with. The first was group education in relation to mental health symptoms. The second was group skills training, so training people how to deal with any symptoms they might have. And the last one, most importantly, was for people to describe what they had been through. So facts, what happened, their emotions, how they felt about it, and how they feel about it now, and their sensations, what they saw, touched, and tasted. And the aim was to try and deal with any early onset post-traumatic stress symptomatology. So this was quite a brief program, and as the Gulf War kind of came to a close, we were getting quite a lot of phone calls from GPs, civilian GPs, who heard about our service, and they wanted us to look after veterans as well. So really, we started to treat veterans on this very brief program. The Navy had a 4-week program, very similar to ours, but we had a 2-week program, and the outcomes surprisingly were quite good. So we did, and this brief program went on for maybe 2.5, 3 years.
Was it ahead of time then in terms of treatment?
Yes, I mean, just to kind of talk technical for a minute, the Israelis had set up something called a COC project in 1994. They published their outcomes, and their project was to rehabilitate soldiers who potentially had post-traumatic stress symptoms, but they only used 2 ingredients. That was education and symptom, if you like, helping people to cope with symptoms. They left out telling the story. The Americans did exactly the same as the Israelis, and their outcomes were terrible. Our outcomes were good.
When was that? Sorry,
that was in 1994.
Oh, still.
Yeah. So the publication was 94.
Right, okay.
We knew what the Israelis were doing. We knew what the Americans were doing, but we went our own way, as it were. And then the interesting thing was the Australians. They had a big problem with their veterans from Vietnam. They sent 60,000 men to Vietnam. Okay. They had a big backlash socially, where, if you like, Second World War veterans didn't believe that or treat veterans from Vietnam as real veterans, and they were excluded. They were pelted with rotten eggs and tomatoes as they marched back through Sydney. That's one regiment. And so there was a big backlash, and the government in Australia wanted to set up a cutting-edge service for veterans. So we were visited by a chap called Mark Creamer, a great friend of mine now. He's a professor in psychology. And he borrowed the 3 ingredients and set up a 6-week program in Australia, which ran from the mid-90s right up to the 2000s and is still running today. And his outcomes were superb. So the 3 ingredients were skills training, psychoeducation, and trauma-focused therapy. So when I eventually came to join Combat Stress, which was 11 years ago, my remit for the Board of Trustees, the only reason they employed me was I had a track record setting up services for people with PTSD. And they said to me, you need to set up cutting-edge services here at Combat Stress. Here are 3 respite care homes. We didn't have any kind of real...
I want to push you back. You're going ahead.
Yeah.
I could see though, but and actually there's a real synergy in everything.
Yeah.
And
sure.
You take, and you've referred to it already, that actually the lessons learned can help the future generations.
Help the future.
And it seems what you're talking about from the Gulf War and actually the rehab services that you set up.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm talking rubbish here, but it seems like we've kind of devolved a little bit with the MOD because. And the awareness is out there, but it seems like the care. Even recently, I've heard kind of top military personnel talking, and the language is not where it should be. But maybe can you?
It's changed, you see, because we had hospitals in my time. I was trained as a psychiatrist in military psychiatry by military psychiatrists. Nowadays, if you train in psychiatry in the military, you train in the NHS, and then you kind of serve for 5 years as a psychiatrist when you're fairly senior, so you're not going to really learn any new tricks. Yeah. And you don't have a hospital, you've only got a community service, and community services in my time were just coming in. So what happened, if you like, after the Gulf War I rehab service was that eventually Gordon left the Air Force, and I left in 1997, and we went to a hospital called Ticehurst House in East Sussex, where we set up a tertiary referral service in the private sector because there were no jobs for trauma specialists in the NHS because they hadn't cottoned on to how important this is. And most of our patients were either uniformed or ex-uniformed services, so ambulance, veterans, lots of veterans. But I ran a unit for adult survivors of sexual abuse, and I set up a 90-day program for these people who were really unwell and they'd been kind of detained under the Mental Health Act in the NHS. And somebody then had decided to question the diagnosis because Someone had realised that there'd been trauma in childhood, usually sexual abuse in childhood, and so my service at Ticehurst aimed to take people off their detention section, and really deliver the three ingredients: education in relation to their symptoms, coping with your symptoms, so coping skills, and then trauma-focused therapy. And many, in fact, the vast majority got off their mental health section, and the aim was to rehabilitate them to a long-term psychotherapy service in the community, which really worked extremely well. So that was a big learning for me. And not only perhaps was I involved in with veterans and with other civilians who've been involved in quite a number of traumas in a war setting or in an ambulance setting or fire setting. Well, now it was childhood as well, which is quite difficult to treat. And then eventually I went to.
Just on that though, this because to me, and we've had a brief chat about this. Adult survivors of sexual abuse. These cases are often complex post-traumatic stress.
Sure.
And from the outside in, that to me is like hell. It's like hell. Is. But as someone like you who's in the profession, who has the tools to actually help people, what is it? It's a real. I've been to and fro about this question because I think people like you, it's a positive that you're there, but the negative kind of subject and topic around it is really quite uncomfortable. But did you feel proud to be then and actually making that kind of impact?
It's so difficult to know because no one else really was doing this work in a kind of with an aim to rehabilitate people off their mental health sections, getting them out of hospital, making them very safe. There were techniques, dialectic behaviour therapy was coming in the late 1980s. It's a special form of cognitive behaviour therapy where people are, if you like, trained behaviourally not to self-harm, not to think in a destructive way, to be constructive, to try and learn, to try and get better, not to lose hope, to interact with others so they don't feel suspicious all the time and think people are getting at them. So that was really important. I think that the fact I had been in the Air Force and I was given the role early on to look at what the hostages might have, and then that work was also used with the POWs. Although I didn't get involved in the POWs personally, but my work was helped the team to have a strategy for the prisoners of war from Gulf War One. I ended up as quite an expert on torture, incarceration, solitary confinement, dissociation.
Yeah, there's not many people that can say that, Walter.
Yeah, well, it was just by default. I just happened to be there. So I made best use of it for adult survivors, and that really helped. And then I worked for 3 years with another quite damaged population. These are kind of women who fell foul of the criminal justice system and had mental illness. So I was medical director for an all-women's medium secure hospital. So this is a locked-up hospital. And when I got there, I found, there was a lot of self-harming. But we set up a therapeutic community, which means that everything was behavioral, had a reward system, there was no punishment. And we brought in, as I mentioned before, dialectic behavior therapy, where people did that for about a year. We had classes. Really, it's just reintegrating people and getting them in touch with their emotions and their feelings, and then educating them. We had a 32 series of lectures in psychoeducation for post-traumatic stress symptoms, and then they got individual trauma-focused therapy and a lot of skills training, and we discharged some people out of hospitals. So that was really a very good experience. But I didn't publish that work. I presented it at conferences because it was at that point, 3 years in that job, that I got the call from combat stress, as it were.
What's before we leap on to your work with combat stress? Essentially, we've got 10 years there. We're dealing with, again, complex PTSD and survivors of sexual abuse and psychological trauma and whatnot. We often talk about post-traumatic stress disorder now, and we sometimes forget that it affects a greater population. Sure. It's not just the veteran population that it affects. Yeah. It's very broad. What is it?
Well, reducing it down to its barest minimum. It's a failure to lay down a proper cohesive memory. So it's a memory problem. It's not necessarily, I don't really look at it as a mental illness in the real sense. So when we're kind of doing anything in our life, our mind is always trying to lay down a memory and putting it in a file. So at the moment I'm sitting down, it will lay down the facts that I'm sitting down here talking to you. I'm a bit anxious, so my emotions will be kind of put in the same bundle as that fact. And sensations, what I can see, touch, taste, and feel with my skin, and the pressure on my bum as I'm sitting down, all that will go into one bundle. It goes through a kind of a fuse box, which is called the amygdala in the brain, and that puts it all into my hard drive, which is called the hippocampus. And that's really how I lay down a memory, and that will go into my kind of. I've been to a radio station to produce a blog with Michael today. Yeah. Now that's a safe memory. Now, when something terrible is happening to me, the mind does something very different. The mind protects me from the horror, and I will either fight to survive, or I will flight and run away, or I'll freeze and someone will kill me. But the brain does not lay down a memory. The rule is, though, that the mind needs to lay down a memory no matter what. So later on, it presents the material for filing. So I get nightmares and flashbacks and intrusive memories. And these are really upsetting because they come out of the blue. They're horrible. They're really the thing that made me feel really frightened, and I haven't been in touch with my emotions at the time. And then what happens is that I become all uptight and hyper-aroused, so very anxious physically and psychologically, looking out for signs of danger, a lot of palpitations and sweating, and I feel emotionally numb and blank inside. And then I realize that the best way to cope with anything is to avoid anything to do with my original trauma, any reminders or triggers, and the more I isolate myself and get myself out of stress situations, the more likely it is that I will cope. But of course, the more I avoid things, the more I don't confront what happened, the more likely it is that my mind will say, please file me away. I'll get nightmares and flashbacks and intrusive memories, and they'll go round and round in circles. And then, what then tends to happen is I adapt to avoiding things so much that I ignore relationships, and I become very isolated, and then I become depressed. So depression is a very common comorbid presentation with PTSD. And in Britain, the way to avoid things especially would be drinking alcohol. So we drink a lot of alcohol, let our hair down, and that helps us to avoid thinking about what happened as well. So alcohol problems are another issue. And of course we could use cannabis, so people use cannabis. And of course, when we go back up the cycle, as it were, emotional numbing is very unpleasant. We just feel blank, good news, big deal, bad news, big deal. So we'll use uppers. We'll use nicotine from cigarettes, caffeine from chocolate, Coca-Cola and other soft drinks, and coffee and tea. And we'll also use amphetamines, ecstasy and cocaine. So PTSD comes in a package to me. It comes with the hallmarks of PTSD, the core cluster symptoms, re-experiencing of the trauma, hyperarousal and emotional numbing and avoidance. But it also comes with depression, alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, amphetamines. People who drink a lot of caffeine-containing medications can become psychotic with caffeineism. I've seen 2 or 3 cases in guys who've had post-traumatic stress. So, but there is a biological kind of reason for this. I talked about the amygdala before. That's the first kind of junction box, the fuse box. When I'm exposed to something horrible, that blows. So you can see, if you do brain scans, you can see the volume of this part of the brain is less, and the volume of the hippocampus, where I'm supposed to store things, is less. Well, actually, with therapy and with some medications, the volume of these 2 areas in the brain can recuperate, and people do recover. So it's very important that people don't feel there's no treatment for me that will work. You may have had a bad experience with somebody, perhaps, who hasn't helped you to engage as comfortably as you'd like to, but actually this condition, post-traumatic stress, is treatable.
You spoke there really a lot of those things about like nicotine and drugs and alcohol and whatnot. They're self-medicating. So
Yes,
people are
they
self-medicated because they haven't initially gone for
That's
treatment,
right.
or
Yeah.
gone because you just touched on something. Then
Mm-hmm.
they've gone for treatment. It hasn't worked. Hasn't been appropriate.
Yes.
They've then gone away and tried to
Yes.
self-medicate to
Yes.
kind of to dumb it all down.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it's a real problem. I think, many people do try and get help early on, and please keep trying, but they don't find the right service, or they don't, their expectations are too high or too low, or they meet the wrong therapist, or they're put on a waiting list for a long time. So at Combat Stress, 80% of our veterans have tried to get help before coming to us. And many of them, there's a huge time delay, between leaving the military and coming to us. On average, especially the older veterans, when there was no education in the military, so Falkland veterans, Gulf War One, Northern Ireland veterans, it can take an average of 12 to 14 years before they come for help. Whereas the younger veterans now, because the MOD has done a lot more education, and people know, they're much more savvy, and your wife or good woman or your girlfriend or your mum knows a bit more about, shell shock, combat stress, PTSD. They're coming much earlier. So the average for Afghanistan and Iraq veterans, respectively, is about 2 years and 4 years after they leave the military to come to us for help, and that's very, very positive.
I think social media has been such a big part to play in this, hasn't it? People can put a negative connotation on social media, but actually, we share things as a small business. We share things. I share things as an individual and as the podcast now, and we push things out quite a lot.
Yes.
And since we've started this, so we're your episode 4.
Yeah.
I am shocked with how many people have got in touch with me since. People who have been suicidal, or it's the first time they've contacted somebody and said, "Oh, I'm feeling suicidal." And I'm like, oh my God. So I then have to go, I'm not a professional, I'm literally just bringing this to the people's attention, but there's some professional help there. Yes. And I suppose I literally could just listen to you. I sometimes lose my thought now because it's so informative what you're talking about. And I've got this big list of questions, and I'm not quite sure what's the best thing to ask. And you've answered a load of stuff there, but I want to break it down again. Just what is the brain actually doing during treatment? Yeah. Because we talked about filing away. Is that what the brain's now actually doing?
Yes, the brain is processing things, and it's kind of getting the part of the brain, the fuse box that's blown, to actually start working again. So it's bonding emotions at the time of the trauma with emotions now. It's bonding those emotions with the facts of what happened, and it's also bonding our sensations. So, for example, if somebody assaulted me on a lawn that had just been cut and the smell of the grass was a trigger, I'd avoid all grass, all smells to do with grass. But actually, a treatment would involve you having to face and confront, and, for you to know that the smell of grass isn't in itself a danger to you. So you need to disentangle the trigger from the fear, as it were. So trauma-focused therapy is to a degree, it's reliving, and it's very difficult. If somebody has been terrified, the last thing they want to do is relive what happened. But if you relive it in a safe environment with a therapist whom you trust, then people do get better. So one surreal clinic, I had a 19-year-old guy who just left the army. He was in Afghanistan. He had rip-roaring PTSD. And then the very next patient was 93. He was a tail-end Charlie from a Lancaster bomber. His wife had died 6 months previously. She'd contained his PTSD for him for 60 years. And they both had the same treatment. The treatment was the same. The complications were different. So, you could get somebody suffering from PTSD so many years that he's lost his relationships, he's got a financial slide, he's not worked for many years, he's now an alcoholic. So the complications are what makes it difficult, and the engagement or ability to engage, and then the kind of the safety of the therapeutic relationship to keep somebody in therapy and to make sure they complete treatment. So in the Air Force, we used to say, Walter, make sure you get all the gold nuggets from your patient. So that's my supervisor, John Rawlins, would say that. And the gold nuggets would be the last things people wanted to deal with, the last things they wanted to share, because they were ashamed, maybe. They were afraid. They felt guilty that they'd let somebody down, where actually in reality they hadn't. and part of therapy is about forgiveness, forgiving yourself, forgiving other people, and looking at things from a different aspect. And then people do grow. I mean, you can see post-traumatic growth even in therapy, and it's really interesting to see.
How do you form that relationship then with?
Well, I think it's important not to scare people off. So what I tell my staff, and what I've always done, is the first appointment, if I see somebody, I'll say to them, look, I'm really interested in your symptoms. I'm interested a little in your military service, and I'm interested a little in your background. And we're not going to talk about any trauma today. So that puts them at ease straight away. Whereas, in a way, they've been really worried. They probably haven't slept for 2 nights because they're coming to see me, and maybe they think that we're going to kind of get a whole story out of them. That's not the case. So once you've seen somebody for 2 or 3 times, then you actually have a plan. And if somebody can't cope with having to disclose his trauma right away, which is fine, then we teach them some skills. That's why the skills are really important, how to cope with your symptoms, because symptoms are going to get worse before they get better if you're going to do any kind of therapy that involves reliving. And also you need to look at and educate them in relation to what the symptoms are. So look, PTSD is a memory issue. It's how memory is formed. You're not weak in any way. This can happen to anybody. The evidence is dose response. The more you're exposed, the longer you're exposed for, the more horrible the thing is, the more at risk you are, the less supported you are by your mates. Maybe you're caught out by yourself, then the more likely it is you'll get this. And I've seen every rank from very top to very bottom with PTSD, believe me.
He won't mind us talking about it. So episode 2, you've listened to episode 2 with Terry. The stuff you're saying there is the stuff he's saying on the other end.
Yeah.
It is absolutely, it's one tour, packed in, full of trauma, full of at risk as well, constant risk. And it's something a lot of people forget. I was just speaking to my brother on the way, and he's done Afghans, Iraqs, all sorts of stuff, did 20 years in. Yeah. And he was telling me about things that had happened. I'm like, that's traumatic.
Yeah, it is.
That's really traumatic. And it's in condensed.
Yes.
And is that why, you look at strength and you look at bravado and you look at the perception of someone in the parachute regiment or the Royal Marines or the Royal Engineers or whatever it is. Yeah. And are you finding that because there's that bravado when people are in, people aren't coming forward and not talking about it and not showing it, again, in commas, kind of weaknesses?
Yeah. It's quite interesting, actually, because there are 2 phases in wars that we expect more mental health casualties, as it were, to come for help. The first is if you have many deaths on the battlefield. And that happened in 2007 in Afghanistan, and that's when we had a lot of veterans, not only from Afghanistan, but also from other wars, come forward, and they'd never come forward before. The second peak, as it were, is when the war finishes, when everybody kind of stops problem solving. So they're not kind of thinking, if I go back to Afghan, how am I going to survive? I have to keep very strong. I have to keep working. I have to keep at it. All of us need to bond and keep strong as a team. When we kind of know that we cannot be deployed again, or when we retire from the military, when our job changes, when we have time now to focus on thinking about what happened, that's when our delayed onset post-traumatic stress hits, and that's when people go for help.
Really?
So I think that it's almost predictable.
It's like the brain then goes, you can relax now.
You can relax now.
Now start filing this stuff away.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, in the Second World War, everybody came back from the Second World War and knew that they had to rebuild the country. Everybody knew about the Second World War. Their wives, everyone who stayed in the UK and wasn't deployed overseas. So everybody was on the same page. And the casualties for mental health weren't that great to start with. In fact, most casualties occurred when people retired at 65. So what happens is people problem solve. They have to have a family. They have to have children. They have to have a job. They have to have a house. They have to carry on with their career. At 65, they stop. There's no career. There's no responsibility. I'm retired. And then I reminisce, and that's when it hits me. So delayed onset post-traumatic stress for the Second World War, commonest at 65.
There's this constant there. Everything you said was meaning, purpose, meaning,
yes,
purpose,
very important
meaning, purpose.
Meaning,
retire.
Yes, nothing. Well, not nothing.
Not nothing, but actually that.
But you're relieved of any responsibility, and unless you have, if you're busy, like my 93-year-old was kept very busy by his wife, and then she died, then and I saw him many years ago. This guy. So, yeah.
And generally, you know, there's forgotten victims in this, and you've alluded to it several times, and just then, that you know, spouses, partners, and children are affected by trauma of people who've experienced trauma.
Yes,
and do you kind of get involved with that?
Well, we as a charity, actually, in our
So we're now talking about combat stress.
At combat stress, we don't, in theory, get directly involved in treating families, but our articles probably allow us to. So they're quite woolly. So we have done. I mean, in 1994, I set up a research department at Combat Stress, and we've done 3 projects in relation to families, particularly spouses and carers. So we know that of the guys that we treat who are the illest, their carers and spouses are ill, many of them, very high rates, maybe 3 or 4 times the rates for alcohol problems, PTSD by emotional contamination and depression. And we also know that the ones who drink most are the ones most likely to have young children in the house. So we are really concerned. We've set up a group education program, and we're looking at the results now. So it's the study's finished. We're about to kind of look to publish our outcomes. So this is a program we imported from Michigan, Veterans Association in Michigan, which has been very successful. And now we're looking to pilot it also using Skype, with groups on Skype, because it's very important that spouses and carers, and we hope, if we get funding, to do a children's study as well in relation to need, but most importantly in relation to intervention. So it's very important to look at the whole family rather than just the veteran.
It's fascinating. It really, really is, and you know, you essentially got these big, strong characters who look after and provide for their families, whether it's a man or a woman or whatever, and then they're really facing difficult times, and that fight and the battle in their head can be really fierce. Again, we sat on a panel once, and I'm not saying I'm on the same level as you. I was there for a different reason, but someone said, "Well, there's a cure." I don't know if you remember this. They said, "Oh, there's a cure," and you was like, "Well, I'd love to see.
A cure.
I'd love to see that. I'd love to see the cure." What you're saying.
Yeah.
But is there a cure? Can we break through? And then when we break through, you've said it 3 or 4 times. What's next?
Yeah, I think, look, cure is a very strong word for me, and that raises a lot of expectations. So, what I'm always after is improvement in function. Function in relation to work, socialization, relationships at home especially, and meaning of life. And also reduction in symptoms, so less alcohol, less depression, less PTSD. And for some, there is a cure that's meaningful and that lasts. But it all depends on how severe things are to start with, and how intensive the treatment is. So to go back to when I was asked to take over at Combat Stress. I mean, by the way, I was the first medical officer ever to be employed full-time by Combat Stress, even though we're going to celebrate our centenary next year. The Board of Trustees told me, they said, look, you're going to have a lot of guys coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, plus we have a lot of veterans from all the other wars, and we've been running respite care for the last so many years. What can you do to help? I said, well, the Australians came to see our rehab program when I was in the Air Force. I think I need to import the 6-week program from the Australians. So the first thing I did was I rang Mark Creamer, remained a great friend of mine. I said, look, Mark, I need to send some staff to Australia. We need to look and see how you've upgraded things. I'd kept an eye on his publications. There were a lot of good outcomes. And so we imported the 6-week program that eventually got funded through the NHS in 2011. And equally then, we appointed community psychiatric nurses, and we had welfare officers in the community, which now we've replaced with occupational therapists in the community. And then we grew our psychologists. So now we employ about 40 psychologists across the UK and other psychiatrists. So now we're about 5.5 equivalent psychiatrists. And we have centres in Scotland and in Leatherhead that remain residential for those who need residential treatment. And our residential centre in the Midlands at Audley Court, unfortunately, has now become a day centre. Because we need to move into the community more, but B, because of financial pressure as well. So Combat Stress has been running quite good cutting-edge services. Our 6-week program outcomes are better than Australia, which they're modelled on. They're better than America. And, the chairman of the VA, Paula Schnur, had a word with me. He said, Walter, why do you get such good outcomes? I said, look, this is a course, a program. We speak the same language as veterans. It's not stigmatizing. They start at 9, they finish at 5. They then have a wraparound with occupational therapy centres that are open 24/7. They're bonded as a team. They do project work together. Those who cannot start to talk a lot about their trauma, they get art therapy to help them to open up, as it were. We have a very, very low failure rate in that, we have about 6% don't complete, which is really incredible, because the Americans have between a 46 and maybe 60% non-completion rate.
Yeah.
So people dropping out. There's no point investing money in cutting-edge clinical services, even if they're properly evidence-based and work, if people don't engage or they drop out. So it's very important that whatever clinical services you set up are user-friendly, and they're tailor-made for, in our case, for veterans.
It's such good, and
It's critical.
I'm a big fan of you guys, and but I wanted to ask you one question actually, and you've gone through a lot. How do you cope with stuff? How do you offload?
Well, I'm kind of lucky. Firstly, I've got hobbies. I like painting.
Just lean into your mic a bit, mate. Sorry. Just
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
So firstly, I'm lucky. I've got hobbies. I like painting. I do watercolors and oils now and then. And my father had a hobby of horology, so fixing clocks and watches, which I took up when I was quite young, and I fix clocks and watches in my spare time. I don't have much spare time. I've got a very supportive wife who's a psychologist, so we can certainly do things, but we don't talk about work normally. We just do things together. So I think it's important to have a bit of a structure to your life. And I've always woken up very early. In Malta, you wake up at 5, you go fishing 50 meters down the road. You then feed the cat with your fish if they're very small, and then go and serve mass in church. That starts at 7 o'clock. So I've always got up very early. I'm lucky I can drive to Leatherhead from where I live, which is quite a journey, but I can think. So, look, I'm very lucky. We have very nice colleagues that we work with, not only within combat stress, a very supportive staff, but also with colleagues in the military and in other charities.
It's great. Walter, we're going to have to leave it there, but I really do appreciate all your time, and I really hope this helps someone else. Just get out there, seek help, have a chat with somebody. We'll leave it there.
You're very welcome. I'm very privileged to be here. Thank you very much.